President Biden wants to ban barbed wire at the border. I'm Kevin Cirilli. It's time for the Daily Debrief. Let's get right to it. Israeli Defense Forces have killed Hamas leader terrorist Saleh al-Arouri. It comes as Israel is telling Washington officials that they are shifting to a new phase of their war against Hamas. They've already withdrawn 5 brigades from Gaza, but the death toll has now surpassed 22,000 per Palestinian officials. Meanwhile, concerns continue to grow that the conflict will erupt in the broader region. U.S. Central Command said Iranian-backed Houthi rebels fired 2 anti-ship ballistic missiles from Houthi-controlled areas in Yemen into the southern Red Sea, disrupting international trade and putting the lives of dozens of mariners at risk. And then there's this, a new report out from Bloomberg depicting a port in North Korea. Satellite imagery photos show that once dormant port located just a couple of miles from Russia has come back to life, and it raises serious questions about whether Russia is using North Korean officials and North Korea dictator Kim Jong-un in their fight against Ukraine. Remember, North Korea dictator Kim Jong-un said at the start of the year that North Korea would thoroughly annihilate the U.S. and South Korea if provoked. This specific port is positioned directly between China and Russia, and U.S. officials have grown increasingly concerned about the budding bromance between Putin and China's Xi Jinping. And it looks like Kim Jong-un's got a coal plant right smack there in the middle. All right, it's time now for the Decision Desk 2024 Daily Update, where we are bringing you the latest news from the campaign trail. And today, Nikki Haley is now beating Ron DeSantis in the national GOP average. Let's dive into the crosstabs right now with my friend as well as my colleague Julia Manchester, because Julia, you can see that gaffe in New Hampshire about slavery is not hurting her at all. She's got 11.4%, and DeSantis, he's at 10.1%. So what significant impact did that gaffe have on her race?
Look, Kevin, I think that gaffe was sort of a blip in the radar. We saw a lot of Democrats go on the offensive against Haley on it, and we saw Trump, DeSantis, and Chris Christie go on the offense against Haley on it. But we know that the news cycle moves very quickly, and that seems like it was an eternity ago, to be quite honest. So we're on to a new news cycle. Trump is also dominating the news cycle with his own legal issues. And then, of course, you have Haley, who's not only, rising to second place, but she's also announcing earlier today that she raised $24 million in the fourth quarter of 2023. That is huge. I think what these two indicators tell me is that her star is certainly continuing to rise within the GOP primary, and she's solidifying her stance as second place. But the big roadblock for Haley is that she's still not close to former President Trump. I mean, we talk about these debates, how it's going to be a face-off between her and DeSantis, and her and DeSantis are going after each other. But at the end of the day, you really got to ask yourself, how much does that ultimately matter if Trump is able to put a nice little bow on the Iowa caucuses and effectively the primary calendar next week?
Well, Julie, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but Jeff Rowe, he's been gone now for a few weeks from DeSantis' orbit. Is DeSantis scrambling now in Iowa?
You know, I think that case could certainly be made. The last Des Moines Register poll we saw from Iowa still shows DeSantis in second place. He has an operation in Iowa, a very good operation. But I think the problem for DeSantis, and this problem also extends to Haley too, is that Donald Trump has had an operation in Iowa for the past 8 years, and he's been able to perfect that operation. Remember, back in 2016, we saw Ted Cruz have a very strong ground game in Iowa. And I think what you saw the Trump campaign do in the years since that is sort of try to perfect that strategy by really localizing it, hiring these precinct captains, many of who are volunteers, doing these events, running these ads. We've seen him very much laser focused on Iowa. And I know we always talk about Ron DeSantis as laser focused in Iowa, but I think Trump has quietly been doing this behind the scenes, as nationally he's been talking about his legal issues, hitting Joe Biden, sort of being a national candidate.
Yeah, I agree with you. My reporting matches that, specifically in Iowa, and how seriously Trump is taking the Hawkeye state. But I want to ask you on something you mentioned with regards to DeSantis. Was the DeSantis caucus operation good 2 months ago? Is it at risk now that the funds are drying up of being able to continue in a week and a half or so when the Iowa caucus date hits?
Yeah, there's certainly a risk involved. And look, they've had a strong ground game in Iowa. They have the endorsement from Kim Reynolds, the governor of Iowa, who saw how much effort and emphasis he was putting into Iowa. So I think it was a strong operation, and it would be considered a strong operation if it weren't for Donald Trump. I mean, if we took Donald Trump out of this race, we would be looking at obviously a very different race, and Iowa would be looking a lot better for Ron DeSantis. But I've been saying this for quite some time right now. You know, he's put all of his eggs in the Iowa basket, and his campaign is banking on getting enough momentum from Iowa to go into New Hampshire and essentially clean house there. But the problem with that is, as you know, Kevin, the Republican primary electorates or caucus electorates in Iowa and then New Hampshire, very, very different kinds of conservatives. So I'm curious to see if DeSantis does make it out of Iowa, how he plays in a state like New Hampshire, which is much less culturally conservative and more libertarian leaning.
Meanwhile, President Biden is heading back on the campaign trail. He's going to start off in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania on January 6th, where he's going to talk about what happened on January 6, 2021. And then next week, he's headed to South Carolina, Nikki Haley country. So Biden's back on the campaign trail, and he's sending a message that J6 is going to be a pillar of his campaign's messaging. Julia, is that going to work?
Look, I think for a while there were questions about whether that would work. But if you go back to the November 2023 elections in Virginia, we saw a lot of those Democratic candidates not only campaigning on abortion, but also on this issue of democracy and being anti-MAGA. So I think there is certainly that's certainly the Biden campaign potentially taking a page from that playbook. But he's also drawing a contrast with Donald Trump, as the Biden campaign would put it, the pro-democracy candidate or the pro-democracy incumbent. We saw him doing that 4 years ago in 2020 when he talked about how we were at the battle for the soul of the nation. So I think that's sort of a continuation of that. But another thing I'm observing with Biden going to Valley Forge to honor remember what happened on January 6th, then going to Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, is that he's trying to be, in a way, the consoler in chief. And we know that that is a strength of Joe Biden. He's a very empathetic person. He's able to connect with people on issues regarding grief. It's a strength of his. So I think he's trying to highlight that going into this year.
All right. I mean, I'm not sure if did you see this Bob Menendez thing? I mean, we had Claudine Gay yesterday, then we had George Santos a couple of months ago. Senator Bob Menendez, a Democrat of New Jersey, indicted again for accepting illegal bribes from Qatar, mortgage payments, Mercedes-Benzes, watches. I mean, this is, again, different than the other indictment. Julia, this is his third indictment.
Third indictment, and also involving another foreign country. So bad news for Bob Menendez. His campaigns or his team says that this is desperate and that this is an effort to take him down. But where there's smoke, there's potentially fire. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And we've seen a lot of other Democrats in the Senate and outside of the Senate, Democrats in New Jersey, who have essentially turned their back on Bob Menendez. As far as I know, he's still planning to run for re-election, despite the fact that he has this very crowded primary forming on the Democratic side for the Senate race in New Jersey. But it's hard to see where he goes from here. There's just too many negative headlines, too much accusations of corruption. Not a good look for him. Well,
Senator John Fetterman, a progressive from Pennsylvania, says he's got to go. He's got to be removed. Julia, yes or no? One word answer before I let you go. Does Bob Menendez last the week?
Yes.
All right. We'll leave it there. Julia Manchester, thank you as always. The Hill's Julia Manchester. House Speaker Mike Johnson and 60 of his GOP colleagues are at the U.S.-Mexico border calling for more border barriers. Meanwhile, President Biden wants the Supreme Court to remove barbed wire and razors at the border, and federal officials are reopening 4 U.S.-Mexico border crossing points of entry. Texas Governor Greg Abbott, he's installed the barriers to stop migrants from illegally crossing into the United States. And the Customs and Border Protection officials are reporting that there's been a whopping 302,000 illegal crossings. I want to repeat that. 302,000 illegal crossings with no signs of slowing down. The White House says Republicans are blocking any meaningful reform. Speaking in an interview with CNN, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas signaled there's an appetite for a solution in the Senate, but hardline conservatives are killing those bipartisan talks in the House. The House Homeland Security Committee announced earlier that it will begin formal impeachment proceedings against Mayorkas.
Well, when they're at the border, they're going to see the magnitude of the problem and why we have said now for about 3 decades that our broken immigration system is in desperate need of legislative reform. So we are focused on solutions, and we hope that they will return to Washington and focus on the solutions as well.
Those impeachment proceedings against Mayorkas are going to heat up once lawmakers return from their recess. The United States national debt has surpassed $34 trillion for the first time in United States history. Democrats and Republicans, they're concerned about the national debt, but they have very different views in the way to solve the problem. Democrats want to tax the rich. Republicans want to cut government spending and entitlement programs. And here's the short-term political impact of how this milestone is going to inject volatility into the conversation in Washington, D.C. The budget fight. We're just a few weeks away from the January 19th deadline for a partial government shutdown. And that means no doubt that the conversation about the national debt is going to be at the forefront of this looming budget battle when lawmakers return from recess. But I want to hear from you. How do you think the United States should deal with the national debt? Let me know down in the comments section below. NASA is one step closer to its human mission to Mars. The space agency released footage of one entire day. And while this may seem like a small feat, it is a very, very, very big deal. That's because astronauts now understand what one day looks like on the 4th rock from the sun. There's only 12 hours in a day on Mars. What would Kiefer Sutherland do with just half a day's time? I don't know. That's it for today's Daily Debrief. My name is Kevin Cirilli. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here very soon for the intersection between politics and policy.